I just gotta say, to open up today's show, that a lot of this YouTube channel's success, quote unquote, and I say success as in like quantifiable, countable numbers. We're talking about views, we're talking about engagement metrics, we're talking about money. A lot of this YouTube channel's success usually dies down after the big trade stuff in the summer. Like, it's no surprise that much of this YouTube channel's productive months will be the months heading into, firstly, the trade deadline in February, March, and then the actual draft at the end of June, and then free agency, July 1st. Those are the days and months where I feel like this YouTube channel thrives the hardest. Everything in between, Stanley Cup final time, January time, December, November time, these months usually are a little bit worse for wear. And maybe there's a little bit of a spike, too, at the beginning of the season. Although this season, the off-season in 2024 was a lot less active, I would say, in terms of rumors and activity, a lot of people speculating about stuff, and big news stories. In prior years, we had really big stories taking over the summer that we could make videos about all summer long. And that's kind of what kept us afloat. This year has been a very different one, and I feel like when you think about some of the numbers, even if you go over to like Social Blade and stuff, you take a look at the engagement on this YouTube channel, some of the numbers for this year have been a little bit dipped in the September, October months compared to prior years. However, I will say, we are getting a little bit more increase in trade-related conversation and trade-related activity amongst the NHL media world compared to this time in prior years. In 2023, I'd say a lot of the trade conversation in that 23-24 year started up around the middle of January. In 2022, same thing. We waited until maybe December or January for things to start going, but now I'd say maybe like the mid to ending point of November, we really started to get some trade ideas, and this is kind of the new norm, I would say. It's a little bit difficult to project these same ideas onto prior years like 2020 and 2021 because those seasons were shut down or extended or pushed a little bit forward due to COVID and the draft and free agency and all that stuff took place at different dates compared to what we were used to seeing. But what I'm getting at here is because there's so much extra trade talk around the league at this time of the season, which is something we are not used to, buckle up, because for the next few days, the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about trades and ideas and all the rumors nonstop. Starting out with this idea here that was talked about on the Sick podcast with Tony Marinaro. This, of course, is not necessarily a trade rumor per se, but I did want to bring your attention to a Sick podcast clip that featured Tony Marinaro as well as Brian Wild. Pretty sure most of y'all are familiar with Wild, but you could go out there and read the video clip here. This was from November 13th. Did the Montreal Canadiens make a mistake by not trading defenseman Mike Matheson while his value was at its highest? Brian Wild said, "My philosophy is that anyone that's high value, that's not going to be around when your rebuild target date is finished, you trade them." And what an opportunistic day to go out there and make this video. The Montreal Canadiens do have themselves a game later today against the Columbus Blue Jackets. However, in yesterday's game that the Habs ended up playing off against the Utah Hockey Club, you did have Mike Matheson not participate. He was out with a lower body injury. It was kind of surprising to people that were paying attention and waiting to see what he would be able to do, because Mike Matheson, for the most part this year, he has been an absolute monster in terms of the usage. The guy averages like 25 minutes a night. He is really, really heavily utilized by Montreal. Top power play, top pair defenseman. He's everything for the Habs on their blue line, and rightfully so, right? After last season where Matheson had himself a 60-something point campaign, whilst being in the business of getting hits and blocking shots, there was no reason for Mike Matheson to be denied his cookies in 2024-2025. You could say, though, that the presence of Lane Hutson on the Montreal blue line would make things interesting for the power play conversation, but heading into the next little while here, I think it's very apparent that Mike Matheson's time as the number one defenseman on the power play may not be all too long-term when you consider Lane Hutson and his presence. Whether or not that continues, we'll see. But this was indeed talked about by the folks on the Tony Marinaro Sick podcast show. My philosophy is that rebuilds take time. With that philosophy, I believe we should have traded Mike Matheson. Any player with significant value who is not going to be a part of your team when your rebuild is complete should be traded. Every single one of them. That means you'll face frustrating years with your young players, but it's part of the process. You'll draft 3rd instead of 9th, and you'll add a better prospect into your pool. And that, I think, is a philosophy that's very difficult to disagree with. Right? I mean, Mike Matheson, he's not really going to be around when Nick Suzuki, Cole Caulfield are contending for Conn Smythes anytime soon. Matheson is 30 years old. By the time Ivan Demidov makes his debut with the team, Matheson will be 31, and by the time Michael Hage, for example, makes the Montreal Canadiens, Matheson will be probably 33, and he's not going to be the top defenseman anymore. That honor will probably belong to Lane Hutson. There isn't necessarily a timeline where Mike Matheson's long-term tenured success with the team aligns with the window that the team has to potentially win a Stanley Cup in the next few years. And I say few years, it's going to take a few years for the Canadiens to fully become Cup contenders. So, trade Matheson away now, make your team worse in the short term, get some more L's, and then find yourselves in a spot where you are contending for a top prospect like James Higgins, like a Michael Misa, or like whomever else is going to be taken 1st or 2nd overall in 2026, in 2027 and beyond. Hopefully, of course, the team is more competitive by that time. It is an interesting idea. And I ultimately do understand the philosophy here. Like, it's really easy to agree with it, especially if you're playing the long game. Like, I think for all of us who have played NHL, be a GM franchise mode, it's really easy to look at this and say, yeah, like, this guy's age, his timeline, it doesn't really align, and his value was so high last year because he was one of the top producing defensemen in the NHL. There's no denying the profile and the value that he would have brought. I mean, other NHL teams could be salivating at the thought of a 25-minute-a-night top power play quarterback defenseman who was able to get 60-something points on the year while playing in a bad team. Does it hurt his value that this year he's not necessarily producing as much? Maybe. Does it hurt his value that all of a sudden there's now another guy who is vying for that top power play spot and who is arguably better as an offensive left-handed defenseman? Maybe. So I do agree here that Matheson getting traded would have benefited the Canadiens in a pretty significant capacity, but at the same time, you get what the Canadiens are trying to do here, right? They're not trading away guys like Matheson and Savard because they want to keep them around for when they win a Stanley Cup, but because Kent Hughes and Montreal are valuing veteran experience, older guys who have wisdom to share and just kind of knowledge to pass on to the younger dudes. Not to say that Lane Hutson needs to get taught everything he knows by Mike Matheson, but just to say that having a stabilizing presence who has been in the NHL for a while, who knows the ropes, who is not brand new to this, in Mike Matheson, rather than having a decor that has Cayden Gooley, Hudson, Arbor Xhekaj, Baron Mayu, and Jayden Struble. All of these guys are young guys who are just kind of breaking into the NHL right now. I can understand the idea that says you need at least 1 or 2 strong-minded veteran leaders, and David Savard is that. He's probably going to get traded soon. Mike Matheson, also that. May get traded soon, who really knows, but the argument that Brian Wild is making is that the Canadiens made a huge mistake by not trading him away earlier and not capitalizing on that value for the long term. If you traded Matheson away for a really good prospect and a good pick, by the time Nick Suzuki and all these guys are competitive and by the time the Canadiens are consistently in the playoffs, then those assets could be valuable. Mike Matheson, on the other hand, maybe would be in his 35 or 34-year-old range, and that's definitely not going to have the same level of value for the team. So let me know your thoughts, ultimately. How do you feel about this idea that the Montreal Canadiens made a huge mistake by not trading away Mike Matheson last year? I'll leave a link in the description to the video, as well as the article that speaks about this idea and gives the quotes. It's on HabsFanatics.com, and I think the writer did a really good job in just kind of putting everything to paper there. But thoughts on Tony Marinaro's podcast, thoughts about the idea that says that the Matheson non-trade was a bad thing, and do you think this has the chance to backfire for the Montreal Canadiens? If they just traded Matheson away, if the team was just worse, where do you think they finish off in the draft? Honestly, it's kind of tough to say because they already got the guy that I think was maybe the best player available at Ivan Demidov in 5th overall last year, but maybe in the next few years this conversation will become more important. But thoughts in the comment section either way. I hope you enjoyed this video. 9 and bye.